Hello, everybody, and welcome to our webinar series. This is the European Marine Board third Thursday Science webinar series, where we are showcasing the science behind the publications, the European Marine Board publications. So my name is Sheila Heymans. I'm the Executive Director of the European Marine Board. And for the next hour or so, we will be discussing the science behind our documents. So to start off with, please, for housekeeping, our housekeeping rules, make sure that your name is clearly entered. So when you ask a question, we know who you are. If you do need to ask a question, please use the question and answer, the Q&A. And again, let us know who you are, where you're from, what country you're from. And if it's for somebody specific, please put the name of who the question is for there. If you have any technical issues, please use the chat function, which is only visible to us. And also be aware that this webinar is being recorded and live streamed on our YouTube channel. So you'll be able to go back and watch it again if you feel the need. So today, the focus of the webinar is the document, the European Marine Board Policy Brief number 9, which came out yesterday, which is about sustaining in situ ocean observations in the age of the digital ocean. Our speaker today is Professor Ed Hill. He is the Chief Executive of the National Oceanographic Centre in the UK. He's an honorary fellow from Bangor University and has an honorary doctorate of science from Sheffield University as well. And that's it from me. If I can ask Ed to start sharing, well, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And Ed, if you can start sharing your screen and take it away. While Ed is sharing his screen, I will also mention that all the other authors of the document are also here today. And when we get to the questions section, we will hopefully have all of them answering questions.
Okay, so I'm sharing the screen now.
Yes, but you are not in full mode.
From the beginning, going into full mode now.
Perfect.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you very much for that introduction, and welcome everyone to this presentation and later panel discussion on the latest Marine Board policy brief, sustaining in situ observations in the age of the digital ocean. The contents of the policy brief cover the benefits of ocean observations, how are they mandated and governed, some of the existing ways in which these are funded, and some suggestions for improvements in the future, some considerations of designing a more effective observing system, and the brief contains 6 key recommendations, which I will cover as we go through the report and summarise at the end. The headline conclusions are, if you look at the present observations, there are some key features. Firstly, in the last analysis, they are mostly funded by national funding and tend not to be well coordinated. The mandates, the drivers and purposes for making observations are very different. And the strongest mandates, which means the most secure funding, tend to be within exclusive economic zones, and the observations beyond that area are less secure in their funding. There are diverse institutions with limited coordination involved in delivering observations, and the funding is piecemeal, short-term, and insecure. And some of the progress that is suggested that we need going forward is to view ocean observations as a critical global, indeed regional sets of infrastructures, which are underpinning a value chain of information that leads to benefit. And that a stable background of or backbone of core observations need to be regarded as the centerpiece of that infrastructure. We need to do more to establish the economic value and indeed the costs of observations, engage users more in the design of integrated observing networks, facilitate the use of existing observing infrastructure, such as commercial vessels and so forth, where that would help to enhance the amount of observation that can be done. And then looking forward to more security of the observations, looking for a governance system which involves binding commitments on nations to contribute to the costs of observing for durability. And there are several models which might be done for that. And then just in terms of the way in which observations are funded now, a lot of it is funded for science and will continue to be so. But ocean science itself is transforming and actually needs greater dependence on infrastructures as opposed to the project-based way of funding ocean science that is prevalent today. So those are some of the key messages that we'll encounter as we go through. So the first thing is to consider that where ocean observations sit, and they really are, if you like, at the base of a large value chain or pyramid, in which the ultimate purpose is to provide public benefit. That chain consists of observations at the base, and without those, there is nothing. But that data that comes out of the observations is transformed through models and analysis into information in the form of products, services, knowledge and wisdom, which is ultimately feeding the information needed in order to take actions to manage it and indeed to understand the ocean. And at each level of that value chain, there is a feedback to the next level down. So, for example, the kinds of use and decision making that is being made feeds back to the kinds of products and services that are wanted. And so the user is placing a big demand into the system, and that in turn shapes the analysis that is done, and in turn shapes the kinds of observations that are required. So that is where it is. This report does not look at all of that value chain. It focuses very much on the observations, which is the base of it, because there are specific difficulties and problems in that area, and it's the foundation of everything above. Just also in terms of this report, to define its scope, it further narrows down onto in situ observations, those that are made in the water, both at the sea surface and indeed below the sea surface. Of course, satellites make a lot of observations of the sea surface, the surface ocean, and those are very important. But there is a particular problem around in situ observations. We're also concerned not with all observations that are made. For example, science makes observations all the time, not of all of which are intended to be sustained over extended durations. They are one-off observations for particular reasons. The focus here is on sustained observations, those which have extended periods, minimum of 7 years, but often indefinite. And they may take the form of observations that are repeated, but with gaps in between, or indeed observations that are continuous. We are particularly talking about ocean observations, the ocean, seas, and the coastal regions, but we also are specifically focused on environmental and ecological variables. There are other observations made in relation to the sea, which are very, very important. Things like vessel tracking, some of the social and human dimension observations that are made in relation to people's attitudes to the sea and so forth. But those were taken out of scope of this survey. It's particularly concerned with the environmental variables in the ocean, again, because there's particular expense and some particular challenges with dealing with those. So referred to before, it's about the value chain, and that value chain is really about the steps that take you from sensors right through to public benefit at the top of the chain and all of the feedback that goes with it. And the public benefit includes the open access to the data, the things that information can do, support the blue economy, improve the health of the oceans, protect people from hazards, and indeed advance science, which is a public good in its own right. So that's the scope of the report. Just briefly, some of the benefits of ocean observations and the GOOS, Global Ocean Observing System 2030 strategy broadly lumps these into three broad categories: climate, ocean health indicators, and operational services. And those where some of the benefits of observations at the base of that value chain sit. And you can see some examples here. Ocean observation is absolutely critical to climate assessment, what we understand about the changes in the ocean heat content, for planning adaptation to climate change, such as sea level rise, understanding changes in variability to improve weather predictions and seasonal and climate predictions, through to indicators of ocean health, the observations of surface plankton in the ocean, for example, showing us how migration of key parts of the food web are moving around, major implications for food security, other health indicators such as the acidification, oxygenation state of the ocean, and so forth. These are all information provided by ocean observations, as well as operational services, whether that be in the form of things like tsunami warning, where a direct benefit in terms of saving lives, through to understanding the wave climate around our coasts with implications for planning of sea defences and moving infrastructures around, as well as leisure activity. So many benefits which are fundamentally underpinned by ocean observations. The United Nations Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development starts this year, 2021 to 2030, has 10 major challenges, and challenges 6, 7, and 8 are termed the key infrastructural ocean decade challenges. And you can see that these three very much are linked to the whole question of sustained ocean observation. Indeed, challenge 7 is specifically about ensuring by 2030 a sustainable ocean observing system. But multi-hazard warning systems are also dependent on observations, as I've described. And challenge 8, which is about creating a comprehensive digital representation of the ocean, is also underpinned by ocean observations. And I'll say more about that at the end. So one of our key recommendations is to strengthen the integrated and combined capability of the ocean observing system to deliver fit for purpose data and information to support sustainable development of the blue economy. So that's a key recommendation. Now, in terms of the benefits, I've described those benefits in qualitative terms, but trying to put a hard euro value on ocean observations is much harder. The economic value is hard to quantify. That's partly because many of the benefits are indirect of ocean observations. But the analyses that have been conducted indicate there is very likely to be a high benefit to cost ratio. For example, the global basic observing network for weather was evaluated as worth over $5 billion a year, which is a benefit to cost ratio of 25 to 1. So that's for weather forecasting, some of which, of course, includes ocean observations as integral to providing quality forecast. But it shows the kinds of ratios which are very, very high in environmental observing. The Copernicus Marine Environmental Monitoring Service which comprises both in-water and satellite observations, did an analysis which showed a benefit cost ratio of over 2 to 1, and other analyses such as by the Jericho program, the OECD, and others have shown high benefit cost ratios. However, this brings us to a second recommendation, is that more needs to be done in this area to establish an ongoing process to review the costs and the performance of the observing system and to map its economic and environmental benefits in order that we can have much better information in this area. Now we are going to talk about what really drives the funding of ocean observations, and this is one of the big issues that we've identified. The funding is fragmented and insecure, but if we want to understand what drives the funding, we need to understand what drives the funders. And there are diverse mandates for undertaking observations. It's not all one thing. The very strongest mandates on the left-hand side of this diagram are those that relate to environmental health and resources of national interest. Things like, and are underpinned by national or European legislation, things like the Marine Strategy Framework Directive. And these observations tend to have their funding prioritized because there's a legal mandate underpinning them. And so when difficult choices have to be made, when budgets are reducing, for example, these tend to get the highest priority. Because the jurisdiction of national and European law is within marine territories, exclusive economic zones, this funding and these observations tends to be focused on observations in the marine areas of the nations concerned. The next strongest mandate comes from marine observations relating to weather forecasting, weather services. These are operational systems. There are obviously strong national requirements for just routine operations, as well as for understanding some of the extremes that are brought about by extreme weather. There is an underpinning here in terms of the World Meteorological Organization Convention, which requires member states to maintain the continuity of a core element of that observing system of a set of 4 variables. And weather forecasting is focused in both the exclusive economic zone, but also by virtue of the scale in areas beyond. And so some of the funding for observations beyond national jurisdiction are in relation to weather forecast. The weakest mandates in terms of these kind of requirements are international agreements, which relate to the ocean, but may imply the need for ocean observations, but actually don't mandate them, or where those mandates are not actually transposed into national law and therefore carry a lot of force. And then the final area, which is actually where a huge amount of the funding for ocean observations comes, is from research, which is science-driven, according to the definition of research, and it's focused according to national research priorities, international research agreements, European research priorities, and it tends to be the main funder of subsurface ocean observations outside of the exclusive economic zones, which is about 60% of the ocean area. Now, in terms of the way ocean observations are governed internationally, the highest level of organization is the Global Ocean Observing System and its regional alliances. But there is also a variety of other scales on which ocean observations are organized. Increasingly, there's been a tendency to organize at whole basin scale, such as the Atlantos program for the Atlantic Ocean, the Southern Ocean Observing System, the Indian Ocean, and the Tropical Pacific Ocean Observing System under the TPOS 2020 strategy. The connection to the global system of all of these is not entirely well defined, and perhaps needs to be formalized and strengthened in some areas. There's a variety of national level coordination of ocean observations. Some examples are provided here where there's particularly good examples of national coordination, others much less so. And at the European level, the European research infrastructures, including the ERICS, have been a framework providing for some of that coordination. But a lot of encouragement is being given to the EU's program, the European Ocean Observing System, as a way to help coordinate this rather complex landscape of coordination which is going on at all of these levels. A lot of it has been organically developed, perhaps overly complex, diverse range of coordination bodies at different levels. Some of them are duplicating activity, it's inefficient. Could be argued in some cases there's even over-coordination, and that the cumulative costs of coordination may even be competing in some cases with resources to actually make observations. And so an important recommendation is to empower and support streamlined, efficient coordination efforts, such as the EU's and of course the global level GOOSE, including clear nationally designated focal points to support ocean observing activities at both the pan-European and at global scales. I will make a brief comparison here between observations in the atmosphere, largely for weather forecasting, and for the ocean, which is a comparison is often made, and the document describes this in some detail. But I'll just point out three of the main differences between them. Atmospheric observations were motivated from day one by the need to provide operational weather services. In the ocean, our observing system's origin has been in scientific research, a very different motivation. And that has affected the way in which the two systems have evolved. Further down this list, about 70% of the funding for atmospheric weather type observations is secure, with the remaining 30%, depending on various other sources of funding, which may be less institutional and more project-based, for example. That situation completely flips for the ocean, where just under 30% of ocean observations are secure in terms of their funding, with the vast bulk of it depending on funding which is not secure for more than a year or so. And in terms of the atmospheric observations, there is a kernel of national and international mandates, which are ultimately exhibited through the World Meteorological Organization's convention that support these observations. In the ocean, there is little in the way of a kernel of international mandates outside the exclusive economic zone, and mandates where they exist tend to be in the latter area. So in terms of funding for ocean observations, there's been rapid technological innovation. In fact, you go back 20 years, it was impossible to make a number of the observations that we take for granted or expect to be able to make today. This technological revolution has transformed the ability to make observations and to do assessments, to provide services and do science. And that technology has reached a level of maturity where we can make many observations reliably in the way that we couldn't do 20 years ago. And so we now have the basis for a real ocean observing infrastructure. The issue is that the funding models and the financing approaches have not caught up with the technological innovation. So how are ocean observations funded today? Well, most funding is and will remain at the national level. And even at the European level, the Horizon programs have supported a lot of observations, but there's a huge hinterland of national research funding, mostly, and other funding that is weighing in to support observations. So there are a mix of existing funding approaches, a lot of project-based funding, fixed term, short duration, in which 5 years is a long time and often shorter. There are some examples of long-term institutional funding. Germany, France, and UK are examples that have that. Some observations are very clearly mandated to be made repeatedly, such as those for national interest, such as fisheries. Capital funding is used to support observations, and I'll say a lot about that in a moment. Some of which is to do with buying equipment, but often there's what we call the no batteries problem. In other words, you can buy the capital equipment, but don't have the funding to operate it on an ongoing basis. It's like having a toy, but no batteries to put in it. And you need both. And operational funding is much harder to come by than capital funding. In some cases, there has been a successful transition from observations funded under research budgets into operational budgets. And the German Argo float program is one example where that has happened. There are a small number of examples of co-funding of observations between different providers where the observations have a dual support, a dual purpose, and both support research, say, as well as some operational function. But those examples are relatively rare. And then there's also in-kind support from various opportunistic sources of infrastructures, like ships of opportunity, where there's a lot of investment gone into that, and those become an important part of the observing system. And so that's a resource that should not be ignored. So I've talked a little bit about ocean, and increasingly this is pointing towards ocean observations being viewed more as an infrastructure than something that is funded by short-term projects. Just briefly, the definition of an infrastructure is something, the basic structure of an organization or a system or a country, which is necessary for its operation, especially things like public water, energy distribution systems, communication, data infrastructures, and transport infrastructures like road networks. Those are the kinds of the basic core of what an infrastructure is. And they've got some characteristics. I won't go through them, but they're high capital costs. Their operating costs is a very high proportion of fixed costs, and they're meant to last for a long time. They provide public benefit. There are multiple users of them. Probably no one user on their own can afford to pay for the whole infrastructure. Many of them, but not all of them, are free at the point of use. Contrast public roads. Some are toll roads, pay as you go. Some are free as you use them. And the capital and operating costs of them are funded by models like general taxation, subscription, user levies, and tolls, but they tend not to be supported by short-term funding like science projects. Ocean observation networks are presently seen too much as a collection of small individual elements and not as a whole infrastructure. We think about individual moorings and floats rather than the whole system. But there are examples of big observing and indeed big science infrastructures out there. Some examples here: the International Space Station, the European Council for Nuclear Research, the CERN facility, EUMETSAT, the European Space Agency. And the report just highlights and draws attention that there are models for operating very large research infrastructures. And some of the features that they have is that there's a binding convention or agreement between member states that buy into these infrastructures. There's a high-level ministerial governance of the core elements of them. There are clearly defined overall costs and nationally defined contributions, financial and others, to supporting those costs over very long periods due to binding mechanisms. And this is the sort of model that perhaps we need for ocean observations. So the key recommendation relating to this is that we should be regarding the totality of the ocean observing system as an infrastructure and supported by appropriate infrastructure related models, such as subscriptions, nationally defined contributions, both in kind and cash. And also, we should use existing infrastructures where we can. Now, just a point here, we're not suggesting that research and innovation simply stop funding sustained ocean observations and they all be passed somewhere else. Research and innovation will always be important in making observations. And indeed, there's a tension in the minds of many research funders who don't like infrastructures. They don't like high fixed operating costs for long duration. It commits funding for long term and squeezes the financial headroom available to invest in new innovative science projects. And research funders are always concerned that what they would be really doing is subsidizing the mandates of other bodies who should be making observations and doing that inappropriately. So those are some of the concerns, and they're generally rather resistant to supporting big infrastructures. At the same time, though, ocean science itself is changing into truly big science, like space science and high energy physics. The questions that are really important are global and basal scale change and variability. And much of the technological innovation has enabled continuous ocean presence with things like the Argo Float program and others. And therefore, scientists are increasingly drawing on a backbone of observations from instruments that they didn't deploy as part of their projects, but use them. And so the proportion of data which is drawn from this general ocean observing infrastructure versus the instruments that scientists deploy in their particular project is going to shift very radically, I suggest, in favor of the former over time. And so some of the science funding models will need to adapt and respond to this change that is happening. But it is a whole system, and a system that's more than its parts. And so if we want funders to think about this as a research infrastructure, then we ourselves need to think of it as a research, as an infrastructure, some of which is supporting research in its own ways. And therefore to think about the way in which it is designed and optimized, not just individual components, but the system as a whole. And therefore to integrate the design and co-design of it, indeed with users of the observing system who are going to use the information and data, integrate the satellite and in-water components of the observations, as has already been done, define what are those core elements of the system, the essential ocean variables, and then rigorous frameworks for guiding the development and the effective and efficient operation of the observing system, such as through ocean system simulation experiments, or OSSEs, and observing system evaluations that can be used to optimize not just individual components, but how different parts of it work together. And a number of examples done under the Atlantos program, indeed, have shown how the system can be optimized by using these techniques. And of course, a key priority is the better integration of biological, ecological, biogeochemical observations into the system. The present observing system is very heavily skewed towards physical climate variables, at least at the global scale. And so one of our key recommendations is to co-design a holistic observing system that integrates all in situ observing capabilities with satellite observations and with models. I mentioned before a number of existing elements of the observing system. And in terms of making the existing system more effective and efficient, a number of existing systems are out there, large commercial ships, research ships, indeed citizens-owned vessels. Here, the capital costs of these, and indeed the very expensive operating costs, are already paid for. To be able to use these as platforms to deliver ocean sciences and other ocean observations requires a small marginal additional cost, much smaller than the cost of one of these ships that you see here, for example, or indeed their daily operating costs. But that small amount of marginal funding is nevertheless large, very often, for the organizations who are trying to deliver it. And so it becomes a barrier to levering this very expensive infrastructure for making observations. And so the report suggests that we need to establish partnerships with the private sector and civil society to include a wider range of ocean observations, and to see if we can develop some incentives such as to overcome the barrier in being able to get that marginal additional cost of using these infrastructures, whether that be things like tax incentives for the private sector to be able to do that. And so coming to the conclusion, the title of the report puts all this in the context of the age of the digital ocean, the age in which we are moving into. We hear, and the Decade of Ocean Science talks very much about a digital representation of the ocean. This is sometimes described as a digital ocean twin, and it provides a strong motivation for robust data and information infrastructure. And indeed, without sufficient observations, and particularly those below the surface, which are measured by the in-water or in-situ observing system, we actually risk having a big digital void in our digital twin. The vast area beneath the sea surface will be left as a digital void. Indeed, many decisions and that will be taken in relation to all aspects of our lives will increasingly be made by sensors operating in the environment, even attached to our own bodies perhaps, representing what is called the Internet of Things, generating big data interpreted by machines in terms of understanding and sensing the environment around us. But for the ocean to be part of the Internet of Things, we do need some things in the ocean. The human view of the ocean, of course, unfortunately, has been out of sight, out of mind for almost all of human history. But by not making observations in the ocean, and in the subsurface ocean in particular, we risk perpetuating this view through machine learning bias. Just as humans really only see the sea surface, so machines will learn only about the sea surface from where we humans mostly provide the data for them, from satellite observations and from measurements that we made at the surface. So are we teaching machines our own view of the ocean, that what is below the surface is also out of sight and out of then the artificially intelligent mind? So let us teach machines about the subsurface ocean too, and bring the ocean into the Internet of Things. And so the final slide resumes the recommendations that I've been through. As I've been through. The headline recommendation is to recommend the sustained in situ ocean observing system as a large-scale, essential enabling infrastructure, which is generating global public good data to create the information and knowledge-based services that feed the value chain of ocean information. Treat ocean observations as an infrastructure and fund it accordingly. Secondly, to empower and support streamlined and efficient coordination of ocean observation efforts, such as through GOOS and EOS at the European level. Strengthen the integrated combined capability of the ocean observing system to deliver the fit for purpose of data and information, which very much involves engaging the users. Establish an ongoing process to review the costs, performance, and the economic and environmental benefits of observations. Establish partnerships with the private sector and civil society so we can maximize the use of existing platforms for observation to bring them in to the whole system, and to co-design a holistic observing system that integrates all in situ observing capabilities with satellite observations and models and is optimally designed. So with that, I would like to acknowledge everyone who's put together a report, the authors, the reviewers whose comments were very much appreciated, those who've done the hard work in coordinating and editing and provided various forms of additional support, and they are all named here on this slide. So with that, Sheila, I will conclude and return to you.
Thank you very much, Ed. That was great. You could probably, stop sharing your screen. And then I don't know if the other authors want to put their cameras on as well. At the moment, I have not received any questions, which quite surprises me. We've certainly had some comments on Twitter, at least, where, you know, most people make comments these days. One of which, and I might put that out to all of the panelists, one of which was about the S-freeze and the fact that we haven't highlighted how well they've done. And my response to that, I guess, was that indeed they have done well, but we need more coordination across the S-freeze and, of course, for all the other observations. So that was my response. I don't know if anybody else has other responses to that comment.
Well, I can.
Yeah, go for it, Pierre-Yves.
Yes, I think the report I mentioned the ERIC on the S3 as an important activity. It's true, it has been quite of a success over the past couple of years, but as you said, it organizes the activity for a given network on platform. And what is missing today, and this is where also all the discussion as part of EU's is taking place, is we need to have something which is bringing together all the different elements. So that's an important building block. It could actually be a model also for the long term in terms of organization, because ERIC do have agreements at government level and so on. But it's true that even though ERIC are quite a success, I mean, the different ERICs are still fighting for long-term budgets. So, but there is a mechanism which is working. So, but we need something more, really much more integrated all along the ocean observing.
Yeah. There's a question from Toster. He said, oh, hold on. Do you guys want to answer that first? Let's go there. Katie and then Martin.
Yeah, I think, we all recognize that the observing system today is an impressive voluntary collaborative achievement, which I mentioned in my little video, testament to a huge amount of work of many individuals and organizations around the world. But I think we're recognizing that now is the time to think about a framework that strengthens that collaboration and enables that collaboration, which is why Ed referred to the need for that backbone, which is a really nice framing, and the sustained investment to support that backbone to enable that broader partnership. ERICs have been mentioned, and this idea of a research infrastructure framework, and the ERIC legal framework is fantastic. I'd be interested to know that outside of France, how many countries actually have research infrastructure funding streams that feed into those research infrastructure frameworks at the European level. I'm not sure there are many, so that would be the ultimate panacea, I guess, in that context.
Thank you, Katie. And Martin?
Sheila, from my point, I think the European research infrastructures and the various forms of them are really exciting and in many ways really very much needed, and many of them very successful in supporting the research side of the house. But I think the main point that Ed was making is, are we not at the time where, in addition to what the research community can mobilize, which is remarkable in the ocean, but are we not shifting the use space also towards, you could call this dual use if you want, or more operational, supporting government ambitions? And so here I'm thinking about warning systems, about getting ready for the blue economy, about regulatory approaches. And I don't think S3s are the answer to that. These need more national investments. We don't have research infrastructure for weather forecasts. We have national infrastructures. So I think this is that shift that Ed was alluding to. And my hope is that we're actually going to use the decade of ocean science for sustainable development to really make that shift, to add in to the research infrastructures, those operational players, and the opportunities that Ed pointed out. So that shift in mindset, I think, is what makes it different. There's a lot of lifting we have to do from not only within the research community, but actually getting into the ocean family and society as a whole to see that indeed is becoming more part of the operations of a country or a region.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, so now we have some questions that's come in. So the first one was from Tosta. He said, very well done, Ed, great presentation, and he likes the policy brief and he agrees with the recommendations, but the question is, how do we get there? And I guess Martin is sort of given one way through the Ocean Decade. I don't know if anybody has any other. I think the Ocean Decade would be a good call to arms, but maybe the question is, how do we actually get there? How do we make it happen? Ed? We can't hear you.
One of the things that the report talks about in one of its recommendations is this idea of actually incorporating within international agreements which relate to the sea. We know that the BBNJ is under negotiation, where there are recommendations relating to the ocean, that they also need to be coupled with requirements to put in place the necessary monitoring that would evaluate and verify those actions. And so the idea that there would then be some body or bodies in which there are nationally defined contributions. So, for example, this may be at the European level, there may be parts of the international infrastructure of organizations that somehow can marshal that. But somehow we need to find a mechanism through the international agreement process whereby commitments to ocean observations become part of other commitments, along with defined financial contributions or in-kind contributions into that as a mechanism. That was one idea that was proposed to move it in that direction, possibly within the framework of the decade. going to catalyze.
Yeah. George?
Yeah, thanks, Sheila. Just to add that it will be very interesting to see what we will hear tomorrow from the presentation regarding the DG Mare consultation, which hopefully we will all be more wise. We'll at least hear what came out from this consultation, which I think is very important.
Yeah. And Katy?
And I'd just like to make also the link to the G7 Future of the Seas and Oceans initiative, which brings together those G7 partners to try and address these issues at the interface between governance and the observing system, and also identify priorities for coordinated investment from those key countries. We are developing an activity around the governance, coordination and funding of sustained observing, looking at from those members' perspectives up into the regional and national coordination, and also looking to work with another G7 working group on global research infrastructures around some of the approaches and best practices across a range of flavors of research infrastructure. So that's a conversation that's also happening in parallel. So we can see if we can develop that intel, and the timing with the decade, as many have mentioned, is a great time to be really bringing those threads together.
Martin, we'll come back to you.
Yeah, Sheila, and another opportunity which I think connects to what Ed was recommending, recognizing that much of that support on the resources will be coming available through national funding, national investments. But actually, if you would ask Germany, what is our collective national investment in ocean observing, nobody would know that. It is not organized at the country level. We did try that at Atlantos, and I know we did the same for France and Spain. And it was the first time that these countries felt anybody ever asked them about this. So they were not ready to give that answer. So I think that relates to what Ed was saying. I mean, I'm sure if I would ask the question, what does Germany do to sustain weather observing and weather forecasting, there's a person in charge who would within a week give you a perfect answer. But we, even if you give them 2 months, they could not come up with a good answer that is semi-comprehensive of what we have going in the ocean as a country like Germany. And I think that is getting us into that way, starting to become to ask these type of questions that Ed was alluding to. So when you think about committing nationally determined contributions, you might want to know, what are we committing already? You know, and I think that's a shift in mindset already. When you go away from how are we supporting this particular research activity, which I think experts in Germany would know that, to the broad enterprise across the board. I think that's the area, I think, where, at least from my reading of the neck of the woods around Europe, nobody really has a good, well, at least Germany doesn't, and others are maybe better organized than we are, but I don't think anybody has it down. And I think that's an area we can make progress.
Yeah. Pierre-Yves, and then Maria, and then Ed, and then I want to go to the other questions. So we'll stop there. So Pierre-Yves.
Yes, a very short answer to Toaster's comment, and to go exactly in the same direction as Martin, is one of the recommendations is, and that's something we also discussed in the framework of GOOS on the EU's, is that we need to have much stronger national structure in terms of ocean observation coordination. So not only focal points, but really on taking really the broad aspect of observation, not only for research, but also for operation and so on. And that's really a huge task, but without this structuration, it would be quite difficult. Then at European level, we have the 2 levels, as we know. We have also the level of the European Commission, and that's another aspect that needs to be analyzed. Yeah.
Maria?
Yeah, I just want to echo what everyone else has said, but you know, in many ways we can just imagine we've had sort of 30 years or more of essentially a pilot experiment where we've tested and proven the feasibility of the technology readiness level and our ability to develop a global observing system. But here at the start of the UN Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development, where all of the decade-old challenges as well as the Sustainable Development Goals all require more and sustained regular information about the ocean, it's really time for us to move beyond this sort of pseudo pilot phase and transition to global sustained operations. And this starts really with getting our own houses in order and asking these questions like, how much money does each nation spend, and how are those coordination structures, and how are those funding streams organized? That will require a lot of international cooperation. Getting the agreed plans will require sort of binding commitments and new models of coordination in governments. And this is where, in specifically going back to Katy's message about the G7 FSOI beginning to look at this across the G7, and Europe is a full member of the G7, looking at the building on the experiences and the practices, first of all, of our own European research infrastructures, but then looking more towards the global models that exist out there, as Ed mentioned, other aspects of the Earth system science, like space science and high energy physics. And so we really need to learn from each best practices across the groups and project ourselves onto the global models, and learning from the groups who have already started tackling these issues.
Thanks. And Ed?
Yes, just to pick up on all of those points. If you ask the member states of the International Space Station how much they spend on it, they will tell you straight away. They know. It's a big thing. They know what they're spending on it. They also know which bits of it they're building. It is very, very clear. If the Global Ocean Observing System had been if the International Space Station had been funded and governed in the way the Global Ocean Observing System is, then it would still be in bits on the ground. We need a bigger vision for what we're trying to build here, and see it for what it is as an infrastructure, because what we still see is it's lots of little bits, and surprise, surprise, it's funded like lots of little bits. If you're building an International Space Station, you know what you're doing, you know what it costs, and you know it's an infrastructure. We need not only a funding mechanism change, but we need a mindset change as to why we need this infrastructure, because the challenges that we're facing together in the world are so big that we need this data infrastructure, because you can't manage what you can't measure ultimately.
Yeah, thanks, Ed. Okay, so then I'm going to go to the next question is by Gilles. Gilles de Leclerc, who is our chair. So nice to see you there, Gilles. He says, Ed, you use the example of the ESA. How do you see the possibility of having a European Ocean Agency, and what could be its role? What about having a stronger goose institution at the international level that gives more strength to the IOC? Any of you? I don't know if you want to start with that one, Ed.
I can start. I do think, given my previous remarks, that there does have to be some sort of institutional framework. I wouldn't want to prescribe what that was. Certainly at the global level, it needs to be strengthened. The Global Ocean Observing System, people do an absolutely fantastic job, but it is a massively under-resourced enterprise in terms of what is needed to do there. It does need some sort of strengthening like the WMO has, so certainly at the international level. And of course, what makes that possible at the international level is some sort of legally binding convention that is underpinning it. So all of these things are elements of what need to be brought together to get some change in the institutional and the legal architecture, I think, to fund it. The report does indeed suggest there might be some such body at the European level as a possibility, but that's the space we need to explore.
Pierre-Yves?
Just, on the specific question of Gilles of international goals, IOC versus Europe, the two are needed. We also had a discussion within the group on how do we organize better at European level, and this was this idea of binding agreement, agency, and so on. Of course, there is also the international level, and this is go together. But that's if you take the example today for satellite observation. So in Europe, we have EMODnet in charge of the organization of the operational aspect of satellite observing, and there is NOAA in the US. So the two organizations are cooperating as part of international agreements through COs. So that's, I think, the two levels. I mean, we have maybe a specific issue here with Europe as a whole, that it's the problem is global and international.
Martin?
Yeah, I think, but I do think as us from the broader Europe, I'm not talking just about the members of the EU, but Europe as a region. I mean, we can imagine building out something a bit more organized. For example, if you take the United States, that's the United States. Many states, they have one integrated ocean observing system. And once they started that, they really got much better in having actually a national perspective of their capabilities and how it's organized. And I do think there's a lot of activity in Europe that almost gets us to that point. And I think the question is, what would the next level be and where's the opportunity? I do think it is something to explore, because I think the other half of the question that was there and Ed commented on, certainly we need more strength at the international level, but I do think that a strong Europe and a unified Europe can also support that by showing that regions need to organize as well, because I don't think from a small country to the global ocean, there's a big impedance gap. If you go through the regions, I think that can be really helpful. So I do think thought about rightly, thinking about the governance and so on, it's a good time to think about that. And I'm almost sure in the next 10 years, we'll see something like that in some form on the scene. And I would very much welcome that.
Thanks, Martin. Okay, now we have a question, or actually more of a comment by Frank Müller-Karger. Sorry, Frank, I am terrible with names. He said that it was pretty clear on the urgency of implementation of a comprehensive fit-for-purpose system, which goes beyond Europe. So we were just talking about that. At the level of individual observers, the idea of large infrastructure may not be attainable. So yes, we need coordination and collaboration, but we also need to help with the very strong linkages to funders. So this is largely national government and down from the development bank and NGOs. So we need the help, as it won't happen just by mobilizing the ocean observing community. I think that is quite clear. So I don't think anybody disagrees with you. Then we have a comment from Bernd Arsbjornsen saying that they've received the Green Deal 2020, I'm assuming, funding to make fishing sustainable by building first platforms that communicate with smart buoys and transducers and fishing gear, so that they can harvest a lot of data that could be useful here. So I think that is good, and collaboration is good. And I will go to the next comment, which I think there was one from Kate. Yes. She said that it's an excellent and timely publication, and the EMODnet Open Conference this week, there was a proposal to that marine data services could better track information on the uptake, use, and impact of ocean observation data, which could help close the loop to show the diverse demand for ocean observations, and this could help secure more sustained funding for the data collection efforts. So her question is, how can marine data services like EMODnet MCs strengthen the collaboration with upstream ocean observation community to make this happen? So I think those two comments kind of come together. I don't know if anybody, Pierre-Yves?
Well, maybe I can start on the first one, on the observation on the fishing vessel. I mean, it's quite important. I mean, Ed mentioned this partnership with the private sector, and that's one of them. We have already very good example where there are observations taken on a fishing vessel with nice, small and smart instrumentation, and that's a real way to improve the collection of observation at sea. On the point by Kate, I mean, I can answer because we are working together between Copernicus Marine Service and EMODnet on that. I mean, this is already something that we try to organize. Typically for the Copernicus Marine Service, we have high-level discussion with ESA, EUMETSAT for the evolution of a satellite observing system. The same for in situ with EUs and Eurogoods and so on. So that's it's very important to communicate on the impact of observation on the services that, let's say, for instance, Copernicus Marine Service or EMODnet provides. We also document them, and this is a part of a regular activity. On actually in the mandates that we are now renewing for Copernicus Marine Service for the next 7 years. I mean, we have an agreement with the European Commission. It's explicitly written. This activity to report feedback on the observing system on needs, on impact, is part of what we we have to.
Thank you. Katie, and then I think we have to close because we've run out of time.
Yeah, so just in response to Kate's message, yeah, absolutely. I'd also point to a current project between Goose, the OECD, and MEDIN, the observation network in the UK, the data network, to look at that uptake and value. And I'm hoping that the phase 1 outcomes will be shared soon, and potentially some links to a broader network of data services to take that to the next level.
Thanks, Katie. And then we have one final question from Johnny Johannesson that Pierre-Yves wants to answer. So I'm going to allow it, even though we've run out of time. He says, in the decade, we could consider to establish super sites that could be used for implementation of more comprehensive observation and testing of design, where also machine learning and OSSIs can become an important part. So Pierre-Yves, you have the last word.
Oh no, it was, sorry, I did it by mistake, but this is an excellent suggestion by Johnny. I mean, that's and we have been discussing this previously. I mean, this is a very good idea, of course.
Yeah. And then just one final comment from Toster. Again, he likes the ideas of NDCs in ocean observing space, which could be similar to the more well-known UNFCCC NDCs. So we need an ocean information convention to support that. And I could not have ended it with any better comment than that. I would just want to thank Ed and all of the other authors of the document. I think it was a great document, and it was pulled together quite quickly in 6 months. So well done, you guys. And I just want to say that our next third Thursday science webinar will be on Thursday, the 15th of July, by Adriana Zingone from Stazione Zoologica Anton Dorn. And she will be talking about biological time series for science and marine status assessment. So it's basically following on from what we were talking about today. So with that, I would just want to thank again all of the panelists, and I will see you guys again next month. Thank you. Bye-bye.